Hello and welcome back to the channel for another video. So this year I've watched 100 films and almost all of them are listed on Letterboxd, and I want to go through the 100 films and talk them through with you. All of these films are new to me, and if you actually count, there's only 98, but there's 2 films that aren't on here because they're rather controversial and I didn't want to list them or talk about them. Let me know in the comments what films you enjoyed from this year. Also, I haven't written any notes for these films. I remember most of them. Starting on the 3rd of January, I watched Buoyancy, an Australian film I believe, which I gave 4 out of 5. I quite enjoyed it. Next we have Himizu. Well, that's how I pronounce it. It is a 2011 Japanese film by Sion Sono. This isn't the only Sion Sono film that will be on this list though, and I gave it 3.5. It wasn't the strongest film of his that I've seen. It was okay. I felt like it fell apart in parts. Next we have In My Father's Den, which is a New Zealand film from 2004. I went through a phase late last year, and even in this list you'll see that there's more than one film with Emily Barclay in it. She's in My Father's Den, and she's the main reason why I wanted to watch it. But I did really enjoy it. I gave it 4.5. Next up we have the oldest film on the list, which is The Crucified Lovers from 1954. A Japanese film, I think, in black and white, that was about 2 people who were lovers and they were crucified. It was just like a tale of 2 people who were really into each other, but they shouldn't have been together and they kind of run away, that kind of thing. I really enjoyed it actually. As you can tell, I gave it 4 out of 5. Next up we have another New Zealand film, a bit more obscure, Stray from 2018. I think if I remember correctly, it's the only film that the director did. I gave it 4 out of 5. It was a bit slow, I remember, but I really enjoyed it for what it was. Next up we have one of the more recent films, Past Lives. And this was a recommendation from my grandma. I generally enjoy these kinds of films as well. It's a bit kind of romantic for my liking, although I'm not against romantic films. I gave it 4 out of 5 because I generally enjoyed it and its story and how it was told. I haven't seen too many 2023 films, but that is one of them. Next up we have another New Zealand film, Daffodils. It's George Mason. He's been in a few New Zealand shows that I've seen. Good actor. Kimbra also does the music for it, who did Somebody That I Used to Know with Gautier. It's a love story told through songs from New Zealand. It was decent. 3.5 is an average film for me, by the way. I classify 3.5 as watchable and rewatchable. But the next film I gave 3 stars, and that is From Up on Poppy Hill. Now, I've been working my way through the Ghibli films. This was one of the weaker efforts, in my opinion. 3 stars means that it was watchable, it was okay, but I wouldn't go out of my way to rewatch it. Like, if you gave me a choice out of The Crucified Lovers, Stray, Past Lives, Daffodils, and From Up on Poppy Hill, From Up on Poppy Hill is the one that I'd be less likely to choose. Next up we have an Australian film, which I also gave 3 stars, Save Your Legs from 2012. It's a cricket film, I think, from what I remember. I don't really remember too much about it, because the same day I watched Backyard Ashes. They're both Australian cricket films. I prefer Backyard Ashes over Save Your Legs. Next up we have another New Zealand film, This Town. The reason why I wanted to watch This Town is because of Robin Malcolm, who is in it, and she was the lead lady in a show called Outrageous Fortune, which is one of my favourite shows of all time, if not my favourite. It was watchable and rewatchable given the rating that I gave it. Next up we have one of my favourite films of the year, Lou. Lou is an Australian film with John Hurt, and Emily Barclay is in Lou as well, and she is the reason why I found out about it in the first place. It also really hit home. It's about a grandpa played by John Hurt who has dementia and goes to live with his family. But yeah, really enjoyed it. Next up we have another 2023 film, an Australian film technically, with Julia Garner. We have The Royal Hotel. This is one of the few films that I watched this year that wasn't on DVD. It was on a streaming service. Quite enjoyed it. Film about backpackers who go to a hotel and it's just not all that's cracked up to be. I think Hugo Weaving's in it, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I quite enjoyed it. Next, the same day, same streaming service. Hallelujah. 3 stars. I enjoy Jennifer Saunders generally, but this was a bit kind of weak. It was watchable, but there isn't anything I feel like I get out of it if I rewatched it. So that's why I gave it 3 stars. Next up, we have a 3.5 star film, another New Zealand film, Tongan Ninja. I heard about it randomly because I think Taika Waititi's in it and Jermaine Clement is in it, and I enjoy what they do, so I thought I'd check it out. I watched it on YouTube, and it was watchable and rewatchable, you know. Some of it hasn't aged well, but it was somewhat funny. A decently old film next, as you can probably tell by the top, we have Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb from 1964. The reason why I watched this was because I decided that I should give Stanley Kubrick a go. The film was interesting. Unfortunately, spoiler alert, pretty sure it's the only Kubrick film I watched this year. I still have 2001: A Space Odyssey to watch, and I still have A Clockwork Orange to watch. They're in my DVD collection, but I haven't watched them yet. I have seen The Shining, or I saw it when I was younger. I decided that I'd try and get into Kubrick, and this was my only venture into Kubrick this year. Next up, we have another Taika Waititi feature, 7 Stages to Achieve Eternal Bliss, which was interesting, definitely unique. There isn't really much more to say about that. It's about like a cult, I think. A lot of good cameos and interesting stuff. So that's the end of January. Next up, we have Goldfish. This is another Sion Sono movie, and this is one of his more highly regarded ones. It's not my favorite of his. It's up there, probably like top 5-ish. The second half of the movie definitely makes it, and it's been a while since I saw it, 19th of February, and I still remember the second half and what happens in it. So it's memorable for that reason. It's about 2 people who own fish stores, and one of them recruits the other guy's daughter to work, and then a bunch of just stuff happens, murder and all that. Next up, we have a South Korean film, one of my favorites of the year, Broker. The reason why I watched this film was because of the main guy. He was in Parasite, and I wanted to watch a bunch of his films, and this is one of them. And I gave it 4.5 stars. Absolutely, just I love the film. About 2 guys who work at a hospital, and they have like a bin thing where people will sometimes like drop off babies that they don't want, and then a woman decides to go and try and get her baby back or help them with the selling or whatever. And it's interesting. That was it for February, unfortunately. Yeah, February was pretty slow. Next we have March, and we started with one of the more controversial movies of the year, I would say. Well, to some extent. So to preface this, it's a 2009 film, and I decided that I would try and get into Japanese exploitation films. It was a genre that I hadn't explored, and I generally don't like to try and watch bad movies, but I thought that I should give some of them a go and just try and have some fun, really change my perspective of watching movies. That's what this year was about, like exploring Kubrick and Japanese exploitation films. And the one thing that hasn't shown up yet, which is a bit of a spoiler, is French extremity films and more controversial films. They were like this year's thing. So we have Vampire Girl vs. Frankenstein Girl, and this is a 2.5, and that's I think the second lowest rating for a film, and that is because I unfortunately didn't do much research into this before I got it and watched it, but there is some pretty bad blackface and racism in this movie, which if I'd known about, I wouldn't have watched it. That's the thing with like all of these films. They're generally like, oh, that sounds interesting, I'll watch that, and maybe they're like highly rated on Rotten Tomatoes, or they're an actor or a director that I like, but generally they're like blind watchers, and like all of these are new films to me this year. So next up we have another Japanese exploitation film, a better film, The Machine Girl, which is about a girl, I think she's fighting and gets her arm chopped off and it gets replaced with the machine gun, I think. Silly, stupid, fun. I enjoyed it. That's why it's 3.5, because it's rewatchable. But don't worry, the Japanese exploitation films don't stop there, because next we have Tokyo Gore Police. I think I put this in like my top 10 of the year, even though it's like a 3.5. I still really enjoyed it, and I've actually watched it again since. Similar to like Machine Go in a way, but it's kind of like mutants and stuff like that. But I really enjoyed it more than the rest of them. The rest of the Japanese exploitation films. It's definitely my favorite of the lot. Next we have another Japanese exploitation film, Robot Geisha. Yeah, this is about a geisha that turns into a robot. So that's something, I guess. It was alright, it was just a bit over the top. As you can see, these last 4 films here were all made within like 2 years of each other. It was just a thing. Next we have another film called Revenge, a Love Story. I don't remember where this is from. It was a bit rough. It was a bit full on. But it's definitely worth watching. It's a bit heavy, but if you're alright with like heavy stuff, then that's okay. There's murder in the movie and there's stuff like that. Next up we have a film from the same year, The Housemaid. I gave this 3.5 as well. It was kind of interesting. It's about a housemaid obviously who goes and starts working for a family, and she sleeps with the dad and shit hits the fan basically. But yeah, it's interesting. Enough originality to me at least that it's rewatchable. Next up we have an English speaking film, well largely. We have Yorgos Lanthimos film. We have The Lobster. Now this isn't the first Yorgos film I've seen. Actually it's the second. The first one is Dogtooth, which I watched last year, but The Lobster was a recommendation from a family member and I quite enjoyed it. Interesting concept, unique as Yorgos is. That's all there really is to say about it. Next up we have a 90s film, Kronos. Now Kronos is the directorial debut, I believe, of Guillermo del Toro, who directed, well, my top 2 favourite films of all time, Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage. I think he directed The Orphanage, I'm not sure, but he was associated with it anyway. So I've been trying to go back into his filmography and slowly kind of get through it. I haven't gotten through too much of it, probably like halfway. Like I still got to watch like Crimson Peak and Are You Afraid of the Dark and more of his English speaking stuff, but I've seen like The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, and this isn't the only Del Toro film I watched this year though. There'll be another one a bit later. Next we have another Japanese exploitation film, and the worst film I saw of the year, Hell Driver. Now Hell Driver is ridiculous to the point that it is potentially probably maybe the worst film I've ever seen, and that's all I'm gonna say about it. We have another Japanese exploitation film next, which is Alien vs Ninja, which is alright. Aliens versus ninjas, you know, it's just how it is. It was a lot more enjoyable than Hell Driver, that's for sure. But next we have a film that's kind of in the middle of them. I gave it 2.5. It's another Japanese exploitation film, and that is Yakuza Weapon. Bit similar to Machine Girl, but just male and worse. Next up is another Japanese film, but we're changing pace again because for the first time, really, I saw it when I was young, but I don't count it because I don't remember it from then. But we have Ponyo, another Ghibli film, and another film that I really enjoyed. I remembered like the first little bit, but I didn't remember like all of it or anything. So I did count this as a first watch. Lovely film. Another 4-star film next is a French film, My Afternoons with Margaret. Just about a guy who sees an old lady reading in a park and decides to start, I guess, spending time with her, I think, from what I remember. That same day, actually, the third film from that day is Memories of Murder. One of my top films of the year. Absolute, just amazing film. Jong-ho, I believe that's his name. I may be mispronouncing it or saying it in the wrong order. Decided to watch some of his other films this year, and there'll be others of his in this list as well. But this was a really good film. And next we have probably my favourite film of the year, another Studio Ghibli film. As you can probably see from the top, it is Spirited Away. Yeah, I saw this when I was like probably 8 or something, because I remember one specific bit that never gets spoken about. It's like where she falls down the stairs, or she's climbing the stairs near the start. I think it's like 20 minutes into the film, and like that's not shown anywhere or anything, and it's only a memory I would have if I had seen it before. But yeah, I sat down and I watched it and I absolutely loved it. The last film of April is The Quiet Family. Like with Memories of Murder, this film also has the poor family's dad from Parasite in it. I don't remember his name. Yeah, he's in it, and that's why I watched this. It wasn't as good as I was hoping it was. Still watchable and enjoyable. Going into May, we have another film that he was in called The Age of Shadows. Now, this film was a bit confusing to me with the subtitles. I couldn't tell who was meant to be the good guys and who was meant to be the bad guys, but I gave it 4 because it was still interesting and I could tell that it was trying to tell a good story, Next up we have another film from the people who did Broker, and that is the 2018 film Shoplifters. I really enjoyed this, as you can tell. I gave it 4.5. About a family who shoplift to survive to some extent, and they find this girl and they take her in and they just kind of look after her and teach her what it is to be cared about and stuff like that. It's really sweet. And now we take another twist. We are getting into the extreme cinema portion of the year. My favourite extreme film of the year, Martyrs. 2008's French classic in my opinion. Absolutely amazing film. Very easy, could have been 4.5. Very heavy, a lot of torture, but very important and interesting story to me. I unfortunately did back this up 3 days later though by watching The House that Jack Built. And the reason why this was an issue is because I think going back to back with those two meant that The House that Jack Built just wasn't scary enough for me to really enjoy. It's also the first Lars von Trier film that I think I'd ever seen. It's not the last one on this list either. Definitely didn't enjoy that as much as I thought I would, but I think watching it after Martyrs was where I made the mistake there. French extreme horror next, we have Inside. Inside takes place inside about a pregnant woman who I think on Christmas Eve gets a visitor and is tortured all over the house and stuff like that. There's a story though, it's interesting. I generally don't find films predictable, but I found this one predictable, but I did still enjoy it. Essential to the French extreme horror movement for sure. Another piece of extreme cinema next, we have High Tension. High Tension was interesting. It had twists and turns, but it could have done better, But I think it's still kind of essential to the French extreme horror movement. As is the next film, which you may see on controversial film lists around the place, which is Irreversible, which is a film that is told entirely backwards. The first scene of the film is the end and so on and so forth. There is also a quote-unquote straight cut, which is the film but just in chronological order as opposed to in reverse, but it's an interesting film. An interesting way of a story being told, for sure. And next up, we have another film with the poor family's dad from Parasite. We have Joint Security Area, which is an interesting film about the North Korean border and South Korea and two people who become friends and stuff like that. It took me a while to watch it, a few sittings, but I did enjoy it in the end. Next up, we have an American horror film. We have Hostel. I bought the trilogy, but this is the only one I saw. I watched it with a friend. It was okay, but it could have been better. I'm just not the biggest fan of American horror in general, although there are some exceptions. Next up, we have a complete change of pace. We have an Irish film called Rosie, which is about a single mother. She's poor and it's a family drama and it's sad, basically. And we take another turn with the 2009 Australian film Mary and Max. This is a clay animation movie with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Toni Collette, and I hadn't seen it despite my mother asking me to for years. I hadn't seen it and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Next up, we have a 2023 film called Fallen Leaves. The only thing I really remember about this is that the two main people go to the movies multiple times, but I gave it 4 stars, so I did enjoy it. I think it was paced really nicely, if I remember correctly. Enjoyable film. And the last film for the month, we have Jong-ho's first film, Barking Dogs Never Bite. from 2000. I quite enjoyed this movie. The main lady in it is in something else that I really enjoyed as well. I think she might have been in Broker, potentially. There's definitely parts of this that I was like not the biggest fan of. Like there's a bit, I'd say, animal cruelty in it that just wasn't good. It's also animal cruelty in Inside as well, by the way. Outside of that, it was an enjoyable film. So that's the end of the first page. It's that we have Kiki's Delivery Service, another Studio Ghibli film, and not the last on the list. But yes, I quite enjoyed this, so much so that I ended up buying the anniversary edition a few months ago. But yeah, really enjoyed it. But next up, we have another Studio Ghibli film, The Secret World of Arrietty, which is my second favorite Ghibli film of the year, I think. Loved it. I didn't actually know the story about Arrietty, because this is based on a novel. I didn't know about that. Next up, we have another Studio Ghibli film, Porco Rosso. One of the weaker ones. I generally enjoy them when they're like kind of more about humans and stuff. This is about like a pig that flies. It was alright, watchable and part of the legacy. Not the strongest. Better than From Up on Poppy Hill though. And surprise, surprise, next up we have another Studio Ghibli film, Whisper of the Heart, which I really enjoyed. Yeah, that's all I'll really say about it. But yeah, I did enjoy it. We have another Ghibli film next. We have The Red Turtle, which I was expecting more from, but it's watchable. It has almost no dialogue the entire film, which wasn't an issue. I just felt like the story was kind of weak, to be honest. But yeah, still watchable and still part of the Ghibli legacy. And you'll never guess, but next up we have another Studio Ghibli film, My Neighbor the Yamadas. A completely different art style from the rest of them, but it was still enjoyable to me. And you won't believe it, but we have another Ghibli film next. We have Earwig and the Witch, which I was expecting to like a lot less than I did. I understand there's like, it's an unfinished novel and the animation style is too generic. It's not hand-drawn or anything that you'd expect from a Ghibli film, but it still was watchable. Never at any point did I want to turn it off, you know. Next we have another Japanese exploitation film, Big Tits Zombie. It's not the worst one of the lot. It's just about adult entertainers who get chainsaws and fight a zombie apocalypse, basically. Next up we have another jong-ho movie, Mother. It took me a while to get through this one as well, but I did enjoy it in the end. About a boy who is arrested for the murder of someone and a mother who decides to defend him and says that he couldn't have done it because it's not in his character or something along those lines. Really interesting movie, that one. Next up we have an Australian film, Ellie and Abby and Ellie's Dead Aunt, which was a really nice Australian film. I think the notable thing about this is that there is not a single guy in the entire film, which I thought was interesting. A lesbian romance film. Next up we have Noodle. It's about a lady who has a maid, I think, and the maid leaves her kid behind, and he can't speak any word of their language. Next up we have The Kid with a Bike, a French film about a kid with a bike and a nice lady who decides to take him under her wing, basically. But yeah, I quite enjoyed that too. Next up we have a Canadian film with Helena Bonham Carter, the young and prodigious T.S. Spivet. I was expecting more from this movie. It's watchable and rewatchable, but it's not as good as I thought it would be. Just about a smart kid, basically. Next up we have what I believe to be a French film from 2011 called Goodbye First Love. And this is a kind of like a teen romance film. Sad and sweet and all you'd expect. Definitely one of my top 10, top 15 of the year, for sure. And next up we have Monster. Monster was really good. I really enjoyed it. It's a bit of a mystery kind of film, but it was a film that I saw that sounded good and was meant to be interesting, and I waited for it to come out and I got it on DVD and watched it. I think it's also done by the person who did Shoplifters and Broker as well. And I have another film by that person to watch. It's not on this list, but I imagine I'll get to it next year. Next up we have another Studio Ghibli film. I haven't watched them all yet. I think I've seen 20 of them. We have Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, which was a really interesting film. It's definitely like my kind of Ghibli film, more like fantasy but human based and stuff like that. But yeah, film from 1984. I quite enjoyed it. Next up is a 2014 New Zealand film based on true story about chess called The Dark Horse. It's a good film, has Cliff Curtis in it, who was in Once Were Warriors and Whale Rider. It's got James Ralston in it, who was in Boy. Next up we have another Guillermo del Toro film, the only other that I watched this year, The Shape of Water. Great film. Another film that I wish I'd seen sooner, but I've been kind of waiting to watch it. Decided that I probably just should just watch it. And I did, and I really enjoyed it. The guy who played the faun in Pan's Labyrinth was the preacher in The Shape of Water as well, which is really cool. Nice to see them collaborate again. It's up we have another Ghibli film, Castle in the Sky. The unfortunate thing about Castle in the Sky and Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is that they're pretty similar, and although they were made 2 years afterwards, definitely kind of shouldn't be watched one after the other because they're pretty similar. I felt at times like I was watching almost the same movie, but they're both pretty solid. Next up we have another jong-ho movie, The Host. Another film that took me a while to get through. Interesting film about scientists that pollute a river and some monster grows and they evacuate the city and stuff like that. Next up we have another French extreme horror film, or as it's classified at least. We have Trouble Every Day. Bit underwhelming, but part of the experience, I guess. I was expecting it to be a lot worse than what it was. Next up we have another Lars von Trier film, Antichrist. Antichrist was interesting. I think it's pretty divisive, the film, but I saw the good side of it, I guess. I thought it was well made and well put together, and it's definitely a daunting film, but well made if you ask me. Next up we have another French extreme horror film. We have Frontiers. It's basically about a girl who goes to like a hostel kind of holiday inn, and it's just like, I think there's like neo-Nazis and they're like cannibals or something like that, as you'd expect in a French extreme horror film. Next up we have Stickmen from 2001, a New Zealand film that unfortunately hasn't aged too well, to be honest. It's a bit homophobic at points, which is another point where it's like, maybe I should know more about the movies before I watch them. Just about a 8-ball tournament, basically. We next up have an Australian horror film from 2020 called Relic. Interesting film, has some interesting American connections to it. It was watchable, it was interesting, it was entertaining. Something I'd watch again. Next up we have another Jermaine Clement movie, People, Places, Things from 2015, which is an American film. I don't remember too much about it, I just remember that he has like a studio apartment, I think, and he has kids and she gets a new husband and it's just messy. But next we have the only film that I saw in cinemas this year, and the first film I think I've seen in cinemas in over a decade, and that is Memoir of a Snail, done by the guy who did Mary and Max. Absolutely love seeing it in cinemas. Amazing movie. Just a great film. That's all I'll say. And to end October, I watched a horror film for Halloween, In Fabric. It's not like a Halloween movie, it's just a horror film, and I thought that I'd just watch one. So I watched In Fabric. Really good, solid film. The first Peter Strickland film that I watched. The next day, I would go and watch another Peter Strickland movie, because I would watch Barbarian Sound Studio, and I quite enjoyed it. Just as strange as In Fabric, and just as good if you ask me. About a guy who does like sounds and stuff for documentaries, and then he goes to a different country and they assign him to make Foley noises for a horror film, and he slowly loses his mind. I quite enjoyed it. Not the last Peter Strickland movie on this list though. Next up we have another New Zealand film. We have Uproar. Good film, Julian Dennison, Rhys Darby. Just a good film. And then next we have another New Zealand film. We have The Mountain, about a sick girl who believes that by climbing a mountain that she'll be better, or she'll get answers to her cancer diagnosis or something along those lines. Really good film. Another New Zealand film about Maori history, we have Fina. Fina was good. Rena Owen. Just a good, interesting look at New Zealand history. And then next we have an American film about a struggling author, Starting Out in the Evening from 2007. I enjoyed this film, as you can tell. Lauren Ambrose was great. Actually, no, she was insufferable, but she was good actress in this, and that's why this isn't the only film that she's in. I went out and bought a film that she was in because I just wanted to see her in something else, and I didn't want to watch 6 Feet Under. Good film, interesting film. Next up we have another Studio Ghibli film. We have The Wind Rises. Just a good film. I don't remember too much. I remember that some guy paints. That's all I remember. Next up we have another Sion Sono film. This one is from 2012 and it is called The Land of Hope, which is about a fictional nuclear disaster and just differences between being on the side of where the radiation is and where it isn't, and wanting to leave your home, move on, and not wanting to, that kind of stuff. It was interesting. Next up we have a film that I generally wouldn't watch, but I found it somewhat enjoyable, which is The Lost King, which is about the search for, I think, Richard III. Sally Hawkins is great. And next up we have another American movie about a struggling novelist, oddly enough, and that is Ruby Sparks, which I really enjoyed. I should rewatch it actually. It's an interesting concept, so I don't fully understand it, but there's a bunch of films like that on this list. There's a bunch of films like that in my collection in general. Being ambiguous can be a good thing when it comes to films. Next up we have a New Zealand comedy film, Sion's Wedding. I enjoy New Zealand films and it's one that I hadn't seen, and I just thought I'd watch it. There were a few people in it that I knew about, and I just thought that maybe I should watch it. So I did. And then next we have, naturally, Sion's 2, Unfinished Business. It's poorer than the first one. It's 6 years later. It's a bit sloppier, you know. And that same day, Bunny and the Bull, which is a British film with a bunch of people from the Mighty Boosh, you know. Yeah, it was interesting. The kind of odd that you'd expect from that group, but I hadn't heard about it, and yeah, I enjoyed it. Next up, we have another Peter Strickland film. We have Flux Gourmet. Interesting film about sonic food, something like that. Making music with food, like boiling stuff, and the general premise of it is just like a bunch of art students who get into that, basically. It's a really good actress who is in Barbarian Sound Studio, Flux Gourmet, and in Fabric. Fatima, I think her name is. Next up, we have the other Lauren Ambrose movie, which wasn't as solid, but it was okay. Sleepwalk With Me. It was alright, about a comedian, basically. That's all you need to know, a comedian who sleepwalks. Next up, we have another one of my favorites of the year. Another film I've been waiting quite a while to see, and it finally came out on DVD in Australia, and that is After Sun. Absolutely amazing movie. Really sad, but just a great movie. And then after that we get back into French films. I've watched The Five Devils, and that is because of the main actress Adele. I'm not even going to try and pronounce her last name, but she was in Blue is the Warmest Color, and she is in The Five Devils. The Five Devils is about her daughter in the movie who gets jars and creates scents from things around the world, sniffs them, and it transports her to places. But there's like a whole bunch of characters, and you get to learn like who's in what position and why and everything. It's interesting. It's a bit complicated, but it's an interesting concept. We have another one of her films called Passages, and this is about a gay couple who kind of break up because one of them falls in love with her character, and basically what that is. And then next we have a French trilogy, the only trilogy I watched this year, I think. And that is starting with Three Colors Blue. So I watched the Three Colors trilogy. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. White was the least solid of the three. I didn't watch the next one the next day. The film I watched the next day was in fact Convert, which is a New Zealand film with Guy Pearce in it. It was alright. Interesting stuff about Maori history. But I read some reviews afterwards that kind of changed my mind about it. 2 days later, I watched Three Colors Red. And that is film number 99 for the year, or 97 on this list. So we have one more film, and that was 6 days later. And that is the Australian 2022 horror film, which I gave 4 stars, which is talk to me. I really enjoyed it. I think it's my favourite Australian horror film that I've seen. Not that I've seen too many. It's like I mentioned, Relic. Really interesting. It was filmed in South Australia, and I'm South Australian, so I didn't recognise any of the places though, but regardless. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts on any of the films that I mentioned and what your favourites were for the year and all that. And yeah, shall see you soon for more. Peace.